I want to go right ahead and introduce today's first keynote speaker, Paula McLain, sitting in the front row all the way from Cleveland. Thank you. And we didn't have a chance. She was busy in the coffee line, so we didn't have a chance to get connected with each other. Greg, am I good? Shall I stand away from that, or you want me to use that? Okay. Just because I look like Madonna doesn't mean I sound like Madonna. Paula McLain's critically acclaimed New York Times bestselling novel, The Paris Wife, has been a publishing phenomenon, with over 1.5 million copies in print, painting a more complex portrait of Ernest Hemingway than many of us have come to expect. It transports us through the first wife Hadley's eyes into the sumptuous bohemian world of 1920s Paris and into the heart of a marriage that played a pivotal role in Hemingway's budding literary career. If I look like I have bags under my eyes, it's because I was staying up late reading it, trying to finish the book. The immediacy and intimacy of Hadley's voice is irresistible. And as a woman coming into her own amid such literary legends as Ezra Pound, Gertrude Stein, F. Scott Fitzgerald, and her own husband, Hadley emerges as an unforgettable heroine. McLain's newest novel, Circling the Sun, tells the remarkable story of pioneering horse trainer, adventurer, and aviator Burrell Markham from her childhood in British East Africa to her relationship with hunter Dennis Finch Hatton and her rivalry with out-of-Africa author Karen Blixen, a notorious love triangle that changed the course of Markham's life. Markham was the first woman to earn her license as a professional racehorse trainer, one of the first people in Africa and the world to have a commercial pilot's license, the first bush pilot to successfully scout game from the air for safari hunters under impossibly dangerous circumstances, and the first woman to fly the Atlantic solo, east to west, the hard way. I think we have some photos somewhere of the board that had gone to see some of these planes that were used. These are Amelia Earhart's planes, but who are the board that went out to visit the planes? Impressive. So check out the board members, talk to them about the planes. But back to our speaker today. McLain has spoken to a wide array of audiences across the country, offering a glimpse into her research and the compelling characters that have inspired her fiction, as well as insights into the writing process. She received an MFA in poetry from the University of Michigan and has been awarded fellowships from YADU, the MacDowell Colony, and the National Endowment for the Arts. She is also the author of 2 collections of poetry, as well as a memoir, Like Family, Growing Up in Other People's Houses, and a first novel, A Ticket to Ride. A warm welcome to our first speaker, Paula McLain.
Good morning. I refused to wear the Madonna thing because I don't know, I think I was a diva to the sound guy, but good morning. I'm just delighted to be here. It was funny, she sort of paused when she said New York, right? Because we assume that all writers live in New York, but some of us get to live in Cleveland instead. Glamorous Cleveland. So Tammy Follett actually sought me out last fall, maybe? When I was doing an event for Opus and Olives. Do we know this event? It's a big literary kind of fundraiser for the library. There were 5 authors there, 1,200 people had come out, and Tammy searched me out, stood in my line, and told me she was gonna stalk me until I said yes, and she did. So yay, where's Tammy? Good stalking, excellent. I also want to thank Pario Max, who picked me up last night from the airport with her beautiful big reader daughter, Sheridan, and then also picked me up this morning. And I love the way that we immediately got right into telling our stories, like immediately, like no boundaries, like right to the mat, telling our stories. And that's my favorite kind of woman. I don't like small talk. Small talk to me is exhausting. So why not just be ourselves and get down to it? I mean, that's mentorship too, isn't it, in a way? So mostly I give book talks. I talk about my characters, I talk about my research, how I get my ideas, some of the travel that I do to find my information, et cetera, et cetera. The last event I did was 2 weeks ago when I went to the University of Michigan to speak to a graduating class of kids who had experienced foster care. And the reason I said yes is because I spent 14 years of my life in foster care in California, from the ages of 4 until I aged out of the system at 18, right? So this was powerful, a powerful moment for me. But more than this, to be invited back to Ann Arbor, where I had gone to graduate school, right? But where I had gone to graduate school as the divorced single parent of a 2-year-old, right? So I went when I was 28 and lived in cinder block housing, like a 1-bedroom, crappy, the ugliest apartment known to mankind, seriously, on North Campus. Does anybody know Ann Arbor? There's some really charming parts. This is not one. Where I slept on a futon couch for 2 years. It was like that. It was not a pleasant experience. It actually was one of the most challenging times of my life, which is saying a lot. But it's also kind of such an important part when I point back to and think about my career trajectory, right? Because it's when I gave myself permission to go all in and commit myself to the study of writing, even though the signs did not look particularly good, right? Number one, I was divorced at 28, which I felt like a tremendous failure, in fact. And I had this little guy who was completely counting on me to make good, right? But here I was studying poetry, right? Not exactly the quickest way to get rich and famous, right? So we were living on student loans, about $15,000 a year on student loans that I had absolutely no idea how I was going to pay back, because what was I going to do, set up a little poetry stand on the side of the road? So the questions that kept cycling through my mind, besides what am I doing? What am I thinking? Is this going to be okay? Is this going to be good for my kid? What am I going to do when I graduate? How am I going to support myself and support this person who's depending on me, as I said? And I didn't have any answers to those questions. I only knew that I had to do it. And I just felt that. And I knew I had to get over myself, right? And to get sort of above my doubt, my self-doubt, and all of those questions, because they were just going to hold me back. And I had to, as I said, just go all in. No matter what happened next, I had to be completely present for those 2 years. And they did change my life. It took a while. It was also sort of a miracle that I was there at all. As I said, I grew up in foster care, right? My biological mother only made it to 8th grade. My foster parents at the time, and I had many, many sets of foster parents, barely made it through high school. And when I aged out of the system, as you guys know, this is what happens, right? You turn 18 and all the state support goes away. And so I supported myself as a nursing assistant in a convalescent hospital. I kid you not, $3.27 an hour. And I went to Fresno City College, and the only reason that I was able even to go to community college was because at that time, all throughout the state of California, you could go to any community college for $50 a semester plus books, right? So there I was, in college, and I was a disaster. I was a disaster as a student. I would get these threatening letters from the dean because I was on academic probation, for 3 years. I had a 1.25 GPA. I did. It was not, like I said, the signs did not look good. But part of the reason why I was flailing is because I had absolutely no idea what I could expect. I didn't know what to hope for. I also didn't know what I was good at. I didn't know what I could strive for. I didn't know who I was. So I didn't know how I could get to where I was going. In other words, LOST, right? Doesn't always mean loser, people. Sometimes it just means lost. And then a really surprising thing happened. My mother, who had been gone and silent for 16 years, came back into my life. I was 20 years old, as I said, working as a nursing assistant, going to Fresno City College. At that time, I didn't have a bank account. I didn't have health insurance. I didn't have car insurance. I was driving illegally. When I would get the check from the nursing home, I would go to the check cashing place in the mall and put it in a drawer. So yeah. They call that on the fringe. My mother came back into my life, and I have two sisters, an older sister and a younger, and she made us this kind of deal that she could see that we were struggling, and she had been away, and I'm sure she was dealing with all kinds of things, guilt and accountability. And she said, you know, if you want to move to Michigan and live with me and get to know me, I will help you out with room and board. I didn't know this person. She was a complete stranger to me. And so it was, as the great surprise of my life, that I found myself moving to Michigan when I was 21 years old, to a tiny town a couple of hours north of Ann Arbor that I dare you to find on a map, called Reed City, that had like a Stop and Shop and like one stoplight in town. I didn't own a winter coat, you know, like, or boots or gloves. This whole snow phenomenon was, I know you guys can't really sympathize with that, but was new to me. And I got a job at a Domino's Pizza, right? As a delivery girl with the big pizza wedge on the top of the Ford Fiesta. Very glamorous, very glamorous. And then I got a job in an auto plant making armrests for Jeep Cherokees on a plastics press that ran at like 600 degrees and ran 24 hours a day. But this was motivation to me. Like, I did not want to be a Domino's Pizza delivery girl. I did not want to work in an auto plant around people who had been there for 35 years, right? So I decided that I needed to go back to school, even though I wasn't very good at school. And then something pretty profound happened. I was almost 24 at this point. I stumbled into a creative writing class. And what happened next was not subtle at all. I stumbled into this class and I started to write, and it was like the sky opened. And I thought, finally, this is what I'm good at. This is what I'm good at, and this is what I'm here for. Geez, it took long enough. Took long enough. But I understood even then, even though it felt like I had been stumbling, lost toward that moment of epiphany or aha or whatever we call it, for a really long time, I had also kind of always been headed toward that moment. And I remembered what kind of reader I was when I was a kid. So we switched placements, particularly for the first 4 years, between 4 and 8, about every 7 months. So school was difficult, and making friends was difficult. There was no certainty. Nothing was certain except, our social worker basically coming up the drive, and that's how we knew that we were moving to a new placement. And we would put our clothes into garbage bags, and we would go on to the next. And this is, I can't even tell you what a difficult way that is to grow up. And so I couldn't bear to make new friends at any new school by the time I was about 8 years old. So I made a really sensible decision. I only made friends with librarians. Right? Aw, God bless librarians, right? They're superheroes. And I ate my lunch in the library every day, and I hid out in the stacks, and I read, sometimes alphabetically, but always obsessively, and I got lost in books and other people's stories, and I lived inside books. The characters in books were my best friends, and they were my role models, right? So when I think about it now, it was the books that, other people would say, oh, we read books to escape, and that's somehow a weakness. But in a way, I think sometimes it's our greatest strength, that we can, when we look around us and don't see a happy ending on our own horizon, find a way to lock into somebody else's happy ending and then fling ourselves toward that, sort of with all the velocity in the world. And I realized that the kind of reader I was when I was a kid was preparing me to be a writer, though I could never have guessed that early on. It was that first creative writing professor that sort of saw potential in me and sent me on my way, gave me the tap. I like to do this to young writers today too. Give them the tap that, by the way, you're a writer. Whatever else you are, whatever else you might do with your life, you're a writer, and you owe it to yourself to move it forward. I didn't even know there was a thing that you could get a graduate degree in poetry. First of all, who would do that? Who would do that? Me. At the University of Michigan, which was a couple of hours away. And so I did. And like I said, I was recently divorced. I had this little guy. And so the next couple of years were super, super tricky. I mean, there I was. I could afford 12 hours of childcare a week. Like, that was it. That was maxed out. So my whole experience is I'm surrounded by these bright, effervescent, super ambitious young people, is I was always running for the bus, running from the, some sort of a seminar on Wallace Stevens, running for the bus so I could get to the daycare, so I could go back to the ugly apartment and write my term paper and make the mac and cheese and switch his transformer like from a robot into beast mode or whatever. That's what I remember from those years. I also remember going to coffee shops and libraries and talking to my cohort, the other bright young people who didn't look like me at all, by the way. There were no divorcees around me, right? They're all 24, bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, fabulous, so that was not me. But when I would tell them my story, that I had grown up in foster care, invariably at the time, this was in the mid-1990s, and memoir was really kind of cutting edge then. People were like reading it, and people were making money on writing memoir. So when I would tell people that I grew up in foster care, they kept telling me, oh my God, you should write a memoir. And I would say, interesting idea, but I don't write in sentences, right? Because I was a poet. I'm like, wouldn't that require sentences? And things like chapters and characters and, I don't know, like lots of pages? Isn't that part of what a book is? So I was terrified because I had no idea how I'd even begin to write a memoir. But I was also intrigued. And so I decided I was going to try it. And I did. But the first thing I had to do was like lower the bar to to the ground. To the ground, really. Because what did I know about characters and plot and structure? The kinds of poems that I wrote were like 14-line lyric puzzles. And I was never overt I was always writing about my own story, but sort of like in a very hidden, obscure, lovely way. So people would like read all these images and have no idea that I was really getting down to something quite revealing. So there was that hurdle too, right? I was going to tell my story. I was going to sort of really spill the beans on myself and, sort of kick the skeletons out of the closet. So it was twofold what I was doing. And so what I did was kind of fake myself out. I faked myself out, and I decided I was just going to start with one memory, whatever the thing was that floated to the top, that came out of nowhere, and I was just going to write it from beginning to end. That was a scene, apparently. That's how you do it. That was a scene. This was a chapter. And I was going to write it out from beginning to end. I was going to print it. I was going to turn it over in a drawer and forget about it and go on to the next scene. And that is the way that I wrote my book, really. It was a hot mess when I finished, but I kind of was so encouraged by the fact that I was able to kind of generate this beast. It was my beast. And a list was going around in the writing program then, the fiction writers, different animal, fiction writer from a poet. A list was going around of New York agents. Now, to a poet, a New York agent is sort of like the Wizard of Oz. We're not exactly sure these people really exist. But I had this list, so I did something that you just don't really do. One Friday afternoon, 5 o'clock, I had 2 glasses of wine, like with a straw. And I cold called the first agent on the list, like on the phone, and just said, hello, my name is Paula McLain, and I'm a graduate student at the University of Michigan, and I'm writing a memoir about growing up in foster care, and if you're interested, give me a call. I don't even know what gave me, besides the Chardonnay, the confidence to do that. But like, what did I have to lose at that point? Called her up. She called me back on Monday. And that is how I found my agent. Like, kids, do not try this at home. This is not the way it happens. And yet sometimes we can do everything wrong and still end up with the right outcome, can't we? Right? Everything wrong and still end up with the right outcome because it's part of our story. We're meant to arrive at that moment, even though everything before that moment looks like lost and looks like a hot mess, right? So that was my agent, and I swear to God, like, what an empowering moment that was, you know. What an empowering moment that was. And like when the book got taken, it's like, I was gonna go out on a tour. How exciting. And the first city I ever arrived at on my tour was Minneapolis. Yes. And I did like TV, serious. I'm like, a green room, I get to go to a green room. I was ready for my red carpet moment. And it wasn't as glamorous as I thought it was. And part of it was I wasn't quite prepared for the reality of what I had done. So I got up at like 6 o'clock in the morning to go to some morning news program. And, you know, these people, these anchors, I mean, God bless them, they don't have time to read the books that are actually being shoved into their hands. So here was this thing, I'm being mic'd up, I'm behind the desk, here's this beautiful woman with all this eye makeup. And the guy in the background is going 5, 4, and she looks at me and she's like, so you've written a book? And that's when I knew it wasn't going to be okay. And the first thing she said to me, again, like, God bless her, like, it's her job. She said, so you grew up in foster care and you were abused. What was that like? I don't know, I really have no idea what I said. I mean, I still could not tell you. But I can tell you that after that, I went out to my car and did some silent screaming therapy. There were some expletives. And then I had to go across town to the next place and do it again, right? Because what had really kind of escaped me, I don't know, again, like I faked myself out on the writing part, but I think I had really kind of faked myself out on the revealing part too. And that what I had done was literally by sort of, it was like standing up on a table naked and saying, extra, extra, read all about it. It was really tough. It was really tough for a while. But the other challenging part was the book didn't sell. So when a publisher gives you a bunch of money and then doesn't get their money back, like that's not a happy day for anyone involved. And they do things like they send you negative royalty statements. I know. And sometimes they'll send you these notices that say things like, we're remaindering your books, but you can buy them back if you'd like for $1.61 a copy, because that's what's going to take us to pulp them. Again, not a good day. Not a good day. I decided at that point that what I wanted to do was write a novel. And I had never written a novel before, but before that I had never written in sentences. So again, I lowered the bar right to the ground. At this point, I was remarried. I was pregnant with my second child. My other guy is like 11 years old at this point, I think. And so I started writing this novel. Tricky when you have little kids, right? Tricky because you're not quite sure you can think anymore. And intelligence is leaking from your body, particularly if you're breastfeeding, right? Like leaking from your body, and you're kind of just like don't even know who you are anymore. If you're a real person and a whole person, right? Yes. And my husband worked all the time, and so what I did was I had an hour a day to waddle up to the public library. Libraries had always been good to me. To waddle up to the public library. But when you have an hour a day to work on a book, like, okay, nothing happens very fast. It took me 5 years to write that novel. But you also don't have writer's block. There's no such thing as writer's block. I was so grateful to be there and to be in love with a new book and all these characters and to be in their world, because my world didn't look so sexy, that, you know? It just didn't look all that glamorous either, like being spit up on and not sleeping. So I think that book really saved my life in the times when my kids were really young. And when that book came out, I had all the same fantasies I had had about like family. I thought, my ticker tape parade down Madison Avenue. Like, film agents are going to be calling me on the phone. So what happened was much the same as what happened when I did my first event, and I didn't tell you, when I did my first event in Minneapolis, I was on 2 TV shows, I'd been reviewed in the paper, and I showed up at the event. There were 5 people at the venue, 3 of whom I knew. 3 of whom I knew. It's tough. It's tough. And the thing is, they line up 50 chairs. That's the really hard part. They line up 50 chairs, and you're not sure if those other 2 people just kind of like got lost coming back on the bathroom, or... So when the novel came out, and I said 5 years it took me to write this thing, the first event I did was in Pittsburgh, which is near, kind of near Cleveland, and I drove 3 hours through a blizzard to get to a Barnes & Noble in Pittsburgh, and there was 1 person there. I know, and she's just sitting there, and I loved her. Loved her. And I just sat down next to her, and I'm like, we don't even have to talk about me. Let's talk about you. Can I buy you coffee? Will you be my friend? Seriously, people, it's demoralizing. It's demoralizing, and I'm a scrappy person. I was never going to stop writing. Even if that had happened for another 10 years, 1 person at a Barnes & Noble in Pittsburgh, I wasn't going to give up. I was never going to give up writing, but I had started to think that something was missing, and maybe it was that I hadn't yet found my big idea. I hadn't found my big idea, but I didn't know how I was going to find it, because you can't go to the big box store and get the big idea. I was also fairly sure that all the other writers had stolen every last good idea, and that's why. Those dirty rats. So now I had 3 kids. I had a 4-year-old, I had a 2-year-old, I had like a 15-year-old, and something happened that I could never have predicted. I got my hands on a copy of Ernest Hemingway's book, A Movable Feast. Do we know this book, A Movable Feast? You guys probably had to read some Hemingway in high school, right? More like, The Old Man and the Sea, right? You're like, what is this? Is this really about a fish? Is it deeper? Or like the stories, Hills Like White Elephants, or A Clean, Well-Lighted Place, because I used to teach high school, and all my students are like, what is he talking about? And I would say, I don't know, but the test is on Wednesday. So I knew Hemingway, that guy, but in A Movable Feast, what we have is Hemingway. It's the last book that he was writing when he killed himself in 1961. There were pages in his typewriter, and it's a series of autobiographical vignettes about the beginning of his literary apprenticeship. When he was a very young man, he was just 21, he moved to Paris with his first wife, Hadley, and he hadn't published anything. And he wrote bad poetry, just like me. And he decided that he wanted to go all in and write fiction clear across the board, as he said to himself, and to be up in his rooftop garret writing 1 true sentence at a time. And to me, that was such a beautiful ambition, and in a way more beautiful and more poignant for his having lost it along the way. Because by the end of his life, like Hemingway, maybe you guys don't know, but he's like a gargoyle, alcoholic, misogynist. He hated his mother. He slept with everyone, right? Right? He's so macho, he had to be gay, like that guy, right? But this guy, this young man who had just moved to Paris and had this beautiful, pure ambition, and was also newly married to this woman named Hadley Richardson, who I had never heard of before, and for whatever reason, they just blew my doors off. These people, I remember, like, reading that book, staying up all night to read that book, my hands were shaking. And I didn't even know why I was having that reaction, only that they touched me. And part of it was that they lose each other. So Hemingway was married 4 times. This is his first wife. He says at the end of A Movable Feast about Hadley, I wished I had died before I ever loved anyone but her. Right? And it killed me. It killed me. The other thing was, and if you read A Movable Feast, you'll know this is true, Hemingway doesn't give us the dirt on his own life. He doesn't show us the skeletons in the closet. He doesn't stand naked on the table and say, extra, extra, read all about it. It's actually quite the opposite. He turns the spotlight on everyone else. And so I had all these questions. I mean, just logical questions, like how did these two young lovers meet? And how did they get to Paris anyway? And what happened so that they lost each other? Like, what happened? What happened? What happened? And I was obsessed. I could not even help myself. I drove my ratty blue Subaru to the public library where all good things can be found. And I didn't even know if there were any biographies about Hadley's life or if I could learn anything about her. But lo and behold, there were a few biographies, and I just picked one up at random and let the book fall open. And one of the first things that I read was just an excerpt from a letter that Hadley wrote to a friend of hers not long after she met young Hemingway at a party in Chicago in 1920. And all the hairs on the back of my neck stood up in the library. And again, for no reason that I could even tell you, except like here was this woman like shimmering up out of like lost history, and she had things to say to me. And I thought I knew her. I know this woman. There was something about her humor and her intelligence, her point of view, her sensibility that just kind of shimmered up in the library right off the page. And I thought, this is my girl. This is my girl, and this is my book, and I don't really care what happens next. I have to write this book. And I remember going home that day and writing a letter to my agent, the agent that had suffered like all the negative royalty statements with me. And I wrote her an email, so like just felt electrified. And I said, forget anything I have ever told you about what I am writing. I am writing a novel about Ernest Hemingway's first marriage in Paris, and there is sex and bullfighting and absinthe and menage a trois on the French Riviera. And she wrote me back in like 20 seconds and said, oh, honey, you are too writing that book. Write it as fast as you can. Write it as fast as you can. Well, how exciting was that? But it had taken me 5 years to write the first novel. Like, what would that even mean, as fast as you can? So this was 2008. 2008, and I had 2 or 3 part-time teaching jobs at the time, and like I said, 2 little kids at home. And I did something deeply impractical. I quit all my jobs, 2008. And my husband and I borrowed money from his parents so that I could sit in a Starbucks in Cleveland and write my face off. And this is my favorite joke about the Paris wife. What is the furthest thing away from a Parisian cafe you can possibly get? It is a Starbucks in Cleveland. It is a Starbucks in Cleveland. And every single day I sat in the same chair, and every single day they played the same Norah Jones CD. And people, that was my office. That was my office for $1.80, which is what it cost for a tall, dark roast coffee. That was my office, and I was there every single day schlepping my research materials. First of all, like, what did I know about research? What did I know about Paris? I had never been to Paris. I lived in Cleveland. I had babies. I was dead broke. Like, are you kidding? I could never have afforded to go to Paris. But in a way, like, that is the engine of the book. Like, that's the thing that really sparked for me, like, who wouldn't want to go to Paris in 1920? Like, who wouldn't want to be in a cafe with Ernest Hemingway or like in Gertrude Stein's salon? And there I was. I had found the perfect vehicle. This woman, Hadley, she found me. Her voice made me believe that I had the confidence and the audacity to follow her down the rabbit hole and out again into 1920s Paris, and to think I knew what she was thinking and feeling and who she was, like, essentially, like who she was and what her story was. And it was more fun than I have ever had in my entire life. It was so much stinking fun. I can't even tell you. It was like being strapped to the side of a rocket ship. The story was so good. And I wrote it as fast as I could. I wrote it in 7 months, which is better than 5 years, marginally better. I had never been so on fire, but I also had never been so made use of. Do you know what I'm saying? Like everything, like all of my history and my empathy woke up in a new way. I didn't even know, like I said, what to do with research books, and yet I suddenly knew what to do, and I knew how to follow this book, and I knew how to tell this story. And it felt like destiny. It really did. As I sat in that chair, even then I just thought, something is happening here. No, it's never felt like this to me before. And it was something about finding her voice. You know, I've been credited with like inventing a genre, right? Fictional memoir or something like that. But none of it was rational. I never sat around and said, I know what, this is going to be such a commercial idea. You know, I know what I'm going to do to make it even more immediate and intimate and raw. I'm going to tell it from the first person instead of the third person. There was no rationality about it at all. It was all intuitive. When her voice came to me, it came in the first person, and I never asked why, and I just fell in. I fell in the same way when I was a kid. I fell into all those books, right? And lost myself in this woman's story. And when I came out on the other side and it was time to go out on tour, I have to say, I was a little terrified. The same thing was going to happen. I was going to go out and there would be like one person there, and then it was just going to break my heart all over again. But what really happened was almost immediately everything I had ever wanted as a writer fell into place, and it was like the sevens spinning around on the slot machine, kind of over and over. And I would go to events and it would be standing room only, and people had read my book. Like seriously, I can't tell you how delightful that is, and so much better than the opposite. It's better. One of the first events that I did was in Ann Arbor, which is where I had suffered, right, on the $15,000 a year with my little guy and the mac and cheese and the Transformers. And I was in my hotel room getting ready to go do an event at a Borders. Do you guys remember Borders? Oh, don't we miss the Borders? And I'm standing there looking out the window, and my agent calls, and she has news that the book has hit the New York Times bestseller list. I know. And I burst into tears, obviously. And it felt much more profound that it was happening there, right there, where I had been challenged, it felt like, from the universe to go all in, even though the signs did not look particularly good. They did not look good. And the book was on the list for like a year and a half. And there are no detectives in my book. Nobody gets murdered. There's no pornography, right? It's about art and marriage. And it was so encouraging, you know, to find a readership after all this time. And I still do events all the time where women come up to me and their hands are shaking. They're like, oh my God, I love your book so much. I get told all kinds of things like, it's pornography for English majors. It sort of is. It sort of is. It sort of is. And then the other thing that happens is because I've written about real life people, like who lived in the world, I go into the world and I meet people who knew them. So not long after the book came out, I did an event in St. Louis, which is Hadley's hometown. And I had like a respiratory infection and 102-degree fever, and it was raining cats and dogs, and I was still like feeling sorry for myself. No one's gonna read this book. And I went to this event, and it was standing room only, and all the good people of St. Louis had come out, and I decided I was gonna read a scene from the book that is set in St. Louis. I'm like, this is for Hadley. Like, this is Hadley's hometown, and she deserves my attention tonight. So I read this section of the book, and when the Q&A started, the first thing that happened is right in the front row, this octogenarian gentleman stood up, and his hands were shaking, and he said, that was just beautiful. Aunt Hadley would have loved it. And it was her nephew, her sister Fawny's son, and there were 9 members of the family that had come out. It had never occurred to me that this could possibly happen. And they had read a notice in the paper, and they had called each other up, and he sat there and he cried. We cried together, and he said, you know, Aunt Hadley taught me how to dance. And she was the most remarkable woman, and now the whole world will know her. I mean, when somebody tells you something like that, it's like, then you realize that the ticker tape parades and the Hollywood agents and like all of that is such a small thing to hope for. And it was so personal and so touched me so deeply that what I had done, what I had backed into, stumbled on, was not just changing my life, but like changing all that I thought was possible for me. And the fact that now I get to do this, I get to find women who, for whatever reason, have been obscured by history or forgotten along the way or eclipsed by larger people, and that they have a story to tell. And that I have the gifts to tell those stories. I mean, it's really all that I'm good for, right? To find these lives and to illuminate the particulars of their histories, their personal stories, things they couldn't possibly have told themselves, and to illuminate that and to make history personal, and then to invite all of you to the table to learn about these women too. It's astonishing. I think it's our great good fortune, isn't it, to love our work? Like, isn't that the best thing ever? But it also occurs to me that, all of those, what felt like failures, like all of those stumbling blocks, all the times I was lost and all the times I felt like a loser, essentially, now that I go back, when we have hindsight, too bad we don't have it all the time, right? Wouldn't we like the magic 8-ball to say, sister, you're good. Like, look 15 years ahead, you are glowing. But we don't get that. But we do get what I like to call homing instincts, right? That if we're paying attention, those things that make us feel like we're coming alive. When we meet someone, when we find ourselves in a particular situation, in a job, and we're like, oh, and we fill that space, and it's like suddenly we see an inkling of who we might become. And I think we see those markers along the way. The first time I stumbled into a writing class, when I found Hadley's voice, there are these places that are sort of asking us to kind of lean in. And the failures then can be seen as like rungs on the ladder, right? Like, you can't get to here sometimes without coming up through all of that struggle. And I would just encourage you to sort of be self-compassionate and to see your whole story as part of your inevitable kind of design. And again, we don't get to see all of it at any given moment, but we can know when we're in the right place if we're paying attention by how it feels. So thank you so much. It's been my pleasure to be here.